Every Saturday afternoon, just as the light began to shift through the dusty front windows of McNally's bar, an old man with a limp and a faded military tattoo stepped through the door. No one asked why. No one needed to. Jack Carter moved with the slow certainty of ritual, one hand gripping his cane, the other clutching a cloth so worn its original color was a mystery. He didn't come to drink, and he never stayed long. His purpose was as simple as it was sacred, wiping down the tables before the Saturday rush, just like he had done for over 30 years. There was no paycheck, no applause, and certainly no need. Jack had sold the bar long ago, back when his wife had still been alive, and the idea of slowing down had seemed almost reasonable. But she was gone now, and the home they'd once filled with laughter had become a quiet museum of memories. So, on Saturdays, he came here, where their love had once lived in jukebox songs and sticky tabletops. It wasn't just a bar to him. It was a time machine. He started at the back corner, near the booth where he and Mary had carved their initials decades ago. His hand, though old and spotted, moved with grace. One wipe, fold the cloth, one more. That rhythm, that small act of service, grounded him in a world that often moved too fast for his liking. Some of the younger patrons watched him with curiosity. They didn't know his story, and few ever asked. In the age of viral clips and 5-second judgments, an old man cleaning tables without being asked was either invisible or suspicious. Tommy, the current owner and once a scrappy dishwasher under Jack's command, always gave him a respectful nod from behind the bar. He didn't say much. Tommy had never been a man of many words, but he made sure Jack's coffee was warm and that the jukebox didn't play anything too loud while the old man was working. One particular Saturday, a group of strangers walked in just as Jack was finishing his second table. They weren't locals, loud, leather-clad bikers with patches that screamed territory, not loyalty. Jack didn't flinch. He'd seen tougher men in darker places. They laughed too loudly, cursed too casually, and made a show of ordering like they owned the place. The bar's usual calm turned tense. Jack continued wiping, as if they were just another background noise in a long life full of noise. At the far corner, a bottle tipped. Beer spilled over the edge, puddling along the floor. Creeping toward the leg of one of their chairs, Jack instinctively moved toward it, cloth in hand, unaware, or perhaps uncaring, of the eyes that now followed his every movement. The biggest of them, a man with arms like tree trunks and a sneer carved into his face, stood and turned toward Jack. "Hey," he barked, voice sharp with misplaced authority. "Get your old hands off our table." Jack paused, cloth still resting on the edge of the table. He looked up, meeting the man's eyes, not with challenge, but with the calm recognition of someone who had survived far worse confrontations. "I was just cleaning the spill," Jack said quietly. "You blind or just senile? We don't need your help, Grandpa." The bar fell silent. Even the jukebox stopped. It was the kind of silence that knows something is about to happen. Then it did. With no further warning, the biker drove his fist into Jack's cheek. The sound wasn't loud, but it was final. A dull thud that echoed deeper than volume could reach. Jack staggered back, colliding with a bar stool, his cane clattering to the floor. Blood appeared almost immediately, trailing down his weathered face like a line of red shame across a nation's memory. No one moved. The bartender polished a glass he had already cleaned. Tommy froze in place. A young couple near the door looked away, pretending not to have seen. And Jack, the man who had carried brothers through jungle hell and fire-swept ridges, stood alone, bleeding in the quiet betrayal of indifference. He didn't shout, didn't raise a fist. Instead, he reached into his jacket pocket and retrieved an old flip phone. With hands steadied by years of military discipline, he pressed a single button and brought the phone to his ear. The line rang once. Then, a voice answered, firm, alert, immediately concerned. "Dad?" Jack's voice, though cracked with age, held its steady cadence. "Mason, there's been a bit of a situation at McNally's." There was silence on the other end, but Jack knew his son well enough to feel the reaction. "I'm okay," he added, though he wasn't sure if that was true. "Just figured I should let you know." He ended the call before Mason could respond and sat down slowly on a nearby bench just outside the bar's front entrance. Blood still dripping, the cloth still folded in his hand. Inside, laughter resumed. Not loud, not victorious, just awkward. The kind of laughter that covers guilt with indifference. Jack Carter looked out toward the horizon. He didn't know how long it would take, but he knew his son would come. He always did. Inside McNally's, time resumed, but only barely. The jukebox clicked back to life, but no one listened. Glasses clinked again, but no one tasted. The room still smelled like old oak and bourbon, but now there was a new scent in the air. Shame. The biker who'd thrown the punch, Jake Chains Monroe, returned to his seat with the strut of a man who'd never been told no. He laughed, louder than the situation called for, trying to reclaim a sense of control that had already started to slip. His crew chuckled along, not quite sure what they were laughing at anymore. The rest of the bar remained frozen. No one knew Jack Carter personally. Not really. They knew of him. Quiet old man, polite, always carried that same rag like it was holy cloth. Some thought he might have owned the place once. Others just assumed he was part of the furniture. None had ever asked. And so when violence entered the room, unexpected, unprovoked, most chose what they thought was safety. Silence. Ellie stood behind the bar, barely 20, wiping down pint glasses with a towel that trembled in her hand. She wasn't sure if she was scared or angry. Maybe both. Maybe something worse. Ashamed. She had watched Jack get hit. She had watched the blood drip. She had done nothing. Next to her, Tommy leaned against the bar, his arms folded, mouth tight. He wasn't proud of what had happened. But the bikers paid well, tipped heavy, and came through every few weekends without trouble. Jack was old. Maybe it was better he didn't provoke them. Maybe it was better he just went home. Maybe. Outside, Jack sat motionless on the bench, blood drying across his cheek, his back straighter than any 84-year-old had a right to sit. A part of him wanted to be furious. Another part, larger, quieter, simply grieved. Not for the punch. He had been punched before. War teaches you to take hits and not flinch. No, what hurt now was the stillness in the room, the refusal to act, the way people turned away from injustice like it was an inconvenient reflection in a mirror. He had once believed America was made of something stronger, something braver. Back inside, Jake leaned forward, elbow on the table, smirking as he stared at the bartender. "Old man needs to stay out of places he don't belong," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. World's changed. Ain't no medals for wiping tables. The room didn't laugh, but no one objected either. Ellie set down the glass she was cleaning and looked out the window. Jack sat there like a statue, calm, dignified, wronged. She grabbed her phone and, without thinking too hard, hit record. She didn't film the bikers, she filmed Jack. Just Jack. The blood on his cheek, the cloth in his hand, the stillness of a man who had known storms far worse than this. She typed a caption. "This is Jack Carter, Vietnam vet, quiet man, comes here every Saturday to wipe down tables. Today, he was punched for doing just that. No one stood up for him. We watched it happen and did nothing. Who are we?" She hit post. Not for clout, not for likes, for truth. Out in the parking lot, a little boy stood beside his father, pointing toward the bench. "Is that man hurt, Daddy?" he asked. His father looked, then looked away. "No, son, don't worry about it." Jack heard the conversation. He didn't react, not on the outside. But somewhere deep inside, another thread frayed. It wasn't that people didn't care. It was that they didn't want to care. Inside the bar, Tommy finally broke. He walked out, stepping cautiously toward the bench, like it might collapse under his guilt. "Jack," he began, voice thin. Jack turned. Not cold, not angry, just tired. "Maybe," Tommy continued, "you should head home. I think it's best if—" "If what?" Jack asked. His tone wasn't harsh, it was factual, like a report, like a field debrief. Tommy scratched the back of his neck. "You know, just until things cool off." Jack nodded slowly, more to himself than anyone else. "I built the bar," he said, "put in the floorboards with my own hands. Mary painted the window signs. We poured our lives into that place." Tommy lowered his eyes. "I know." Jack stood slowly, deliberately. No dramatics, just effort. "I've never been afraid of men like that," Jack said. "I've fought better ones, and buried them too." Tommy said nothing. Jack picked up his cane and started down the sidewalk. The late afternoon sun cast a long shadow ahead of him, one that stretched past the bar, past the town, into the heart of anyone still watching. Back inside, Jake poured another shot. One of his buddies, the youngest, glanced out the window, watched Jack disappear into the light. Something about the old man's walk didn't look like retreat. It looked like patience. The kind of patience that comes before consequences. The phone rang once. That was all it ever needed. Lieutenant Colonel Mason Carter was reviewing operational drills with his executive officer when the familiar vibration in his pocket sent a ripple through his chest. Not alarm, but intuition. His father never called without reason, and if Jack Carter called during a weekday, it was usually about something practical, a plumbing issue, a VA appointment, or which tie to wear to a community event. But today was Saturday, and Jack never called on Saturdays. Mason didn't answer with a hello. "Dad?" His voice was firm, clipped, the way it always was when mission mode switched on. "There's been a situation," Jack said, the words soft, but unmistakably composed. Mason recognized the tone immediately. It wasn't weakness, it was restraint. Jack had always spoken that way under pressure. Never dramatic, just facts. Like after Mom died. Like when Mason left for his first deployment. Like when he got the call from the Pentagon that one of his men didn't make it back from a mission in Kandahar. "What happened?" Jack paused. "I'm fine. Just thought you should know." Mason closed his eyes. That phrase, "just thought you should know," wasn't casual. Not from Jack. That was Jack's way of saying something had gone too far. "I'll be there soon." "Don't make a mess of it," Jack said. Mason ended the call and stared at the wall in front of him for 3 full seconds, fists clenched. The room around him seemed to stretch and tighten all at once, every cell in his body awakening to a singular purpose. He turned to his executive officer. "Clear the schedule. Prep the convoy." "Sir?" The officer blinked, confused. "Is this an operation?" "It's personal." The officer hesitated. "Sir, with respect, we need higher approval to mobilize for—" "I'm not asking for authorization. This isn't about protocol. This is about my father." The room quieted. Mason stood straighter. "This is the man who raised me with nothing but truth and his 2 bare hands. The man who put on a uniform before I was born and wore it until he couldn't anymore. If he calls me after taking a hit, then someone crossed a line that shouldn't be crossed." The team responded like they always had, with precision. Orders issued, vehicles prepared, gear packed in silence. No one asked further questions. Those who knew Mason knew that if he was moving, something serious had happened. He changed out of his fatigues into civilian wear, black boots, dark jeans, a plain olive t-shirt. His father's old unit pin clipped just above his heart. No medals, no insignia, just bloodline and purpose. He stepped into the lead Humvee, flanked by 2 armored SUVs that could hold their own in any terrain, urban or battlefield. He wasn't bringing firepower. He was bringing witness, and presence, and consequence. The convoy pulled out, kicking up dust in its wake. As the asphalt unrolled beneath them, Mason found himself staring out the window, not at the landscape, but at a series of memories rising uninvited. The first time he broke his arm. At 9 years old, Jack had splinted it with duct tape, drove him to the ER with his jaw clenched tight. Didn't say a word, but the whole drive, his hand was on Mason's shoulder. The day Mason enlisted, Jack didn't stop him, didn't discourage him, just handed him a pocket knife with 3 letters carved into the handle. JFC. Jack Franklin Carter. "You'll earn your own initials," he'd said. And the last time they trained together in the backyard, Mason home from Afghanistan, Jack slower, but still sharp, still balanced, still moving like a man who knew what it meant to fight smart. "You don't win with strength," Jack had said. "You win with stillness." Mason had never forgotten that. But today, there would be no stillness, not until his father's dignity was restored. The radio crackled. One of his men updated him. GPS showed arrival in 23 minutes. Mason checked the loaded digital folder on his phone. Ellie's video had already gone viral, and someone had tagged Mason's military handle. The story was out. Good. Let the world see what silence looked like. Let them feel the weight of it. He replayed the call in his head. His father's voice, quiet but controlled. That breath right before he hung up. Jack Carter hadn't called out of weakness. He had called because he trusted Mason to understand. And Mason did. This wasn't about revenge. It was about something much older, much heavier, about what gets passed down from father to son, from generation to generation. It was about the line, the invisible line between right and wrong, courage and cowardice, standing and shrinking. And today, someone had stepped over that line. Mason wasn't coming to fight. He was coming to make it right. The road to McNally's stretched long and straight, cutting through the heart of a country both Jack and Mason had spent lifetimes serving. As the convoy moved through rural intersections and sleepy neighborhoods, Mason's thoughts drifted back. Not to the bar, not to the biker, but to the quiet forge that had shaped both him and his father. Jack Carter had enlisted in 1960, not because he had to, but because he couldn't imagine doing anything else. Born to a generation raised on ration books and radio broadcasts, Jack believed in work, order, and the quiet honor of doing your part. He didn't talk much about Vietnam. The stories he did tell were stripped of gore or grandeur, just glimpses of brotherhood and burden. Like the time he carried a wounded comrade 4 miles through rice paddies under sniper fire, or the Christmas he helped bury 6 friends in the mud without a chaplain. Don't confuse silence with absence, Jack used to say. Sometimes the quietest man in the room has the most to say. As a child, Mason hadn't understood that. He'd once thought his father cold, distant, a man who polished boots more than he hugged his son. But in time, Mason learned to read the pauses between Jack's sentences, the weight of his silences, the truths carried in his hands rather than his voice. Their bond wasn't built with bedtime stories or Little League games. It was built in the way Jack taught Mason to fold a flag, not just as an act of respect, but as a ritual of memory. It was forged in 4 a.m. jogs when the world was asleep, and father and son ran side by side in rhythm with something ancient and unspoken. Jack never told Mason to serve, never pushed him toward the military. He didn't need to. Service was in the air they breathed, in the creak of Jack's old footlocker, in the framed medals that collected dust above the mantel, in the grave visits every Memorial Day, where Jack would speak the names of men long gone as if they still sat at the dinner table. Mason enlisted on his 18th birthday. Jack didn't cry, didn't flinch. He just nodded once and handed him a letter. Mason still had it, folded in the same creases after all these years. Son, this world isn't always fair. It won't always be kind. You'll see things that will test your soul. But don't ever confuse cruelty with strength. When you lead, do so with clarity and mercy. When you follow, do so with integrity and fire. And when you stand alone, as you will someday, stand for the man I raised you to be, not the man others expect. With love, Dad. That letter had lived in Mason's vest pocket during every deployment. Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, places with names etched into American memory for all the wrong reasons. And through it all, that folded piece of paper, now yellowed and torn, reminded Mason who he was when gunfire made everything else feel distant. It wasn't the medals or missions that made Mason the man he became. It was Jack's stillness. That same stillness Mason imagined now, as his father sat bruised but composed outside a bar he once built with bare hands and borrowed tools. He could picture Jack on that bench, dignified even in defeat, unwilling to trade humility for rage. Know what's scarier than losing a fight? Jack once told him. Losing yourself in the one you win. Those were the lessons Mason had grown up with, and now he would carry them back into the world that had forgotten their value. The convoy veered off the highway, approaching the outer rim of the town. Inside the lead vehicle, one of Mason's soldiers asked carefully, "Colonel, you sure you don't want to alert the local PD first?" Mason's gaze stayed on the road. "No, we're not here to make arrests. We're here to restore something that never should have been broken." He didn't mean a bone. He meant the line. The line between respect and contempt, between decency and cowardice, between witnessing and acting. That line had been crossed the moment a man thought it was acceptable to hit an old soldier for wiping down a table. But even worse, Mason thought, was the fact that no one stopped him. That's what kept him awake as the Humvee approached a final turn. The punch had been a spark, but the silence? That was the fuel. He thought about the young people in the bar, the bartender, the owner, the couples near the door. All of them had chosen safety over courage. And yet, Mason didn't hate them. He understood them. Fear was a powerful silencer, but it was also contagious. The only cure was example, and example is what Mason planned to bring. Not in violence, but in presence, in clarity, in the full weight of what it meant to be a Carter, and what it meant to protect the legacy of a man who had protected so many. The GPS pinged. Destination, McNally's bar. Arrival in 5 minutes. Mason closed his eyes, not to rest, but to remember. The sun was lower now, bleeding gold across the sidewalk. Jack Carter sat on the bench outside McNally's with his cane resting against one knee, the same worn cloth folded in his hand like a flag waiting to be raised. His cheek still stung, and the blood had dried in a thin, dark line that traced the curve of his jaw. He didn't feel the pain much, not in the way that mattered. He had been hurt before. Bruises healed. Bones knit themselves back together with time and calcium. But dignity, when cracked, healed slower, and only if others helped mend it. That's what hurt now. Not the punch, not even the words. It was the silence, the way the bar had folded in on itself. How he didn't expect heroism, but a single word, a protest, a step forward, anything, might have made it feel less like betrayal. Jack wasn't naive. He had lived long enough to know the world could be cruel, that not everyone was raised to act when it counted. But still, something inside him ached, not for his own sake, but for what that room's silence revealed. He'd fought his whole life believing in a country where decency wasn't optional, where courage wasn't something you scheduled for the convenient moments, where men and women looked out for one another, especially when the odds weren't fair. And yet today, an old man wiping a table had been struck in full view of a room full of Americans, and not one of them had stood. Jack tilted his head back and looked at the sky, as if trying to trace the shape of the world he once knew in the clouds above. He could still see Mary's eyes, laughing behind the bar counter, her hair tied back with a ribbon and her hands forever smelling of soap and cinnamon. This place used to be holy ground, he thought. Now it was just loud. From inside the bar, faint laughter echoed through the door. It wasn't triumphant. It was awkward, nervous. A group of grown men trying to prove to one another they still had control of a situation that had already slipped from their grasp. Across the street, behind the cover of a rusted pickup, Ellie watched. She didn't film the biker. She didn't film the bar. She filmed Jack. Just Jack. There was something about the way he sat, upright, quiet, with dignity still clinging to his posture, that shook her. She thought of her grandfather, gone now 10 years. He had served too. World War II, Normandy. Came home and worked the same job for 40 years, never once asking for anything he hadn't earned. She remembered the way he taught her to shake hands, how he said, "Always look someone in the eye, even if they can't look back." Jack reminded her of him, not just in age, but in presence, in gravity. She hit record. Her voice was a whisper. This is Jack Carter. He came here to wipe tables, something he's done for decades. Today he got punched in the face by a stranger, and everyone else just watched. He didn't yell. He didn't fight back. He just picked up his phone and made one call. I think we all need to ask ourselves why no one else made one. She didn't post it yet, not because she was afraid, though part of her was, but because she wanted to sit with the moment, feel its weight before giving it away to the algorithm. Some things deserve to be understood before they were shared. Back on the bench, Jack slowly unfolded his cloth and wiped a speck of blood from his shirt. The cloth had been Mary's. It still smelled faintly of lemon oil. She used to clean the mirrors behind the bar with it, humming Patsy Cline as she worked. He smiled faintly, despite the ache in his jaw. From the corner of his eye, he saw a small boy across the street tugging at his mother's sleeve. The boy pointed. "Is he hurt?" the boy asked. The mother turned, saw Jack, and pulled her son away gently by the hand. Jack watched them disappear down the sidewalk, the boy still craning his neck to look back. It wasn't malice, just discomfort. People didn't like to sit with discomfort anymore. They covered it with distractions, laughed it off, pretended it hadn't happened, changed the channel, scrolled past. But Jack had been taught differently. You faced discomfort. You didn't flinch from truth. You stood your ground. Inside the bar, the biker was talking louder again, his words more forced now, like he knew the laughter didn't come as easy anymore. The air had shifted, and while no one had said it aloud, everyone inside knew something larger than a punch had occurred that day. Tommy finally walked out. He approached slowly, like a man walking into his own guilt. "I didn't know what to do," he muttered. Jack looked up. "You didn't need to do anything," he replied. "You just needed to know what was right." Tommy nodded, eyes glassy. He shouldn't have touched you." "No," Jack agreed, "but worse than the punch was the fact no one tried to stop it." Tommy wiped at his face and looked away. Inside, the laughter faded again, this time for good. Out of sight, down the road, a convoy of armored vehicles took the final turn. Something was coming, not for vengeance, but for honor. The low hum began as a tremor, just beyond the reach of hearing. At first, it blended into the suburban noise, lawnmowers, traffic, the occasional barking dog. But then it grew, louder, sharper, rhythmic. Inside McNally's, beer bottles paused mid-air. Outside, children stopped playing. Heads turned. Then came the roar. 3 matte black SUVs, followed by a Humvee bearing a folded American flag across its dash, turned onto Main Street with surgical precision. Their tires crushed gravel like bone. Their windows were tinted, and their presence unmistakable. This was not a police response. This was something else, something heavier, something deliberate. Jake Monroe, halfway through a crude joke about old soldiers, heard it first. The color drained from his face. He stood, then sat again, unsure what instinct to obey. His crew fidgeted, tough men in leather now glancing at one another with the uneasy tension of prey sensing a shift in the wind. The vehicles didn't stop in the parking lot. They rolled onto the sidewalk, positioning themselves like guardians, not intruders. The doors opened in synchrony. No one shouted, no one ran. 8 men stepped out, each in dark shirts, boots laced tight, eyes hidden behind polarized sunglasses. They carried no visible weapons. They didn't need them. Their silence spoke enough. From the Humvee, Mason Carter emerged. He moved like a man who knew his power and didn't need to wield it to prove it. Not tall, not loud, but centered, anchored in a way that made the space around him shift. His shirt was plain, no rank, no ribbons, just the glint of a worn insignia pinned near his heart. He looked left, saw the bench. His father sat there, still and calm, as if waiting for nothing more than the sun to set. Blood traced the line of his cheek. The cloth in his hand was now stained crimson. Mason's jaw clenched. He didn't run to him. He walked, slow, purposeful, past onlookers, past Ellie, who had now begun streaming the moment with shaking hands, past Tommy, who stood in the doorway, whispering prayers only he could hear. He stepped through the bar doors like a shadow entering light. The room froze. Jake Monroe stood up, bravado gone, mask slipping. Mason's voice didn't rise. It cut the silence with stillness. "Who struck First Sergeant Jack Carter?" No one answered, not right away. One of the bikers took a step back, as if the question might physically burn him. Jake swallowed. "Look, man, I didn't know who he was." "You didn't have to," Mason said. "The moment you hit a man because you thought he was weak, you told the world who you are." He turned slightly, gesturing. One of the operators stepped forward and, without a word, projected a video from a handheld device onto the wall above the bar. The footage was crystal clear. Jack wiping the table. The confrontation. The punch. The blood. The silence. The video played in full. No one dared look away. Mason turned to Tommy. "This man built this place. With his hands. With his wife. With pride. You sent him outside to sit alone, while his blood was still warm on your floor." Tommy stammered. I didn't know what to do." "You didn't have to do anything," Mason replied, echoing Jack's own words. "You only had to know what was right." The biker crew had shrunk into themselves. Jake opened his mouth, closed it. Sweat lined his brow. Behind Mason, his team remained still, each positioned at a quiet angle. No threats made, only truths enforced. A second operator stepped forward and handed a small USB drive to a local police officer who had just arrived, clearly uncertain about what he'd just walked into. "Video evidence. Witness statements coming shortly," the operator said with professional neutrality. Mason turned back to Jake. "You didn't just strike an old man. You struck history. You struck a man who carried dying friends through enemy fire while you were still learning to walk." He stepped forward once more, voice lower now. "And he didn't call me because he was afraid. He called me because some things, some lines, you don't let stay crossed." Jake finally crumbled. His voice broke. "I'm sorry." Mason didn't flinch. "You're not sorry for hitting him," he said. "You're sorry he had someone who answered the phone." Jake was led out by the police, his head lowered, the weight of consequence finally settling. Back outside, Jack remained seated, his spine straight, his expression unreadable. As Mason approached, Jack looked up with a faint smile that barely reached his eyes. "You came," he said simply. Mason knelt beside him, placing a hand gently on his father's shoulder. "You didn't raise me not to." There were no tears, no dramatic music, just presence, just understanding. Behind them, the team assembled in silent formation and one by one raised their hands to their brows in a salute, not to a superior officer, but to a man whose quiet sacrifice demanded reverence. Ellie caught it all on camera. The father, the son, the silent line of warriors offering a salute, not seen in medals or medals of honor ceremonies, but in the streets of a town that had forgotten its conscience until now. And for the first time in hours, Jack Carter allowed himself to breathe. Part 7. Weight of a Name. Mason didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. The room inside McNally's was already frozen in place. Every glass still half full, every throat suddenly too tight to swallow. The air hung heavy, dense with shame and the aftershock of truths that couldn't be outrun. He stood in the middle of the room, not with soldiers flanking him, but alone. A man, a son. The silence stretched, challenging, daring someone to break it. No one did. Mason let them sit in it a moment longer before speaking. Let me tell you something about the man you left bleeding on your sidewalk. He turned slightly, eyes sweeping over the crowd. Not accusing, not begging, just honest. His name is Jack Franklin Carter, First Sergeant, United States Army. Served 3 tours in Vietnam, 2 in Grenada. Bronze Star for valor. Lifesaver to 18 men who would have died in a rice paddy if he hadn't dragged them out one by one. A pause. None of that would have mattered today. Not his medals, not his past. What mattered is that a human being was struck in front of a room full of other human beings, and no one stood up. Several people shifted in their seats. No one met his eyes. Mason continued, voice steady. I'm not here because I outrank anyone. I'm not here because I lead soldiers. I'm here because I carry his name. Because when my father was disrespected, you didn't just insult a man. You insulted what built this place, what holds this country together. He pointed to the floor. This building exists because of him. He put in the floors with his own hands, painted the walls, tended bar after 12-hour shifts, working construction to support my mother, who made the best fried chicken within 3 counties. Some of you drank on their dime when you had nowhere else to go. No one spoke. Even the jukebox, motion sensor triggered, seemed too afraid to start playing. Mason's voice softened. When I was a kid, my dad didn't have time to talk much. He wasn't the kind of father who read bedtime stories or played catch. He was the kind who taught me how to shake a hand, how to lace my boots, how to show up even when you're hurting. I didn't always understand him, but I always respected him. He let the words hang in the air. You know why he still comes here every Saturday? He asked. It's not for the beer. It's not even for the people. It's because it's the only place left that still carries the scent of a life he built with the woman he loved. A few patrons blinked hard. Mason exhaled. I'm not asking you to admire him. I'm asking you to remember who you are. He turned toward Tommy, who still stood behind the bar, like a man unsure if he belonged in his own skin. You had a choice today, Mason said. You all did, and you chose silence. Tommy's throat bobbed as he swallowed. I froze, he muttered. I didn't know what to do. You don't have to be a hero to stop a wrong, Mason replied. You just have to move. SP. He stepped toward the center of the room again. I've seen young men lose their lives for less than the silence I saw in here today. I've held 20-year-olds in my arms while they bled out, asking for their mothers. And do you know what I think when I come back home to places like this? I wonder what they died protecting. No one could answer that. Mason didn't wait for one. He looked toward Ellie, who now stood by the wall, her phone lowered, her eyes full of something stronger than regret. I don't want revenge. My father doesn't want pity. What we want is for you to remember that respect isn't about age or medals or uniforms. It's about character. And you don't earn that in silence. Then he walked out. No dramatic turn, no slamming door. Just the soft creak of wood beneath boots. Outside, the sun was just starting to dip. Golden light bathed the street in quiet absolution. Jack was still sitting, hands folded in his lap. He looked up as Mason approached. "How'd it go?" he asked, the corners of his mouth twitching in a near smile. "They listened," Mason said. "I'm not sure they heard, but they listened." Jack nodded. "That's something." Mason knelt again, not because his father asked, but because the moment required it. "Dad," he said, "I'm sorry I didn't get here sooner." Jack reached over, his hand weathered, warm. "You arrived," he said. "That's what matters." Behind them, the bar door creaked open. Tommy stepped out. He walked slowly, like a man waking from a long sleep. In his hand was a drill. In the other, a new sign, white oak with carved letters, already stained and varnished. He held it out. "I'd like to hang this above the bar," he said. Mason took it, ran his fingers across the words. "Built by a soldier, guarded by honor." Jack stood slowly, every joint resisting, but his spine still straight. "That'll do," he said. That night, the town of Stafford Falls didn't feel like it had been changed by violence or by soldiers in dark SUVs. It felt changed by memory, by truth, by the weight of a name no one wanted to forget again. The street had mostly cleared. The military convoy had rolled away without fanfare. The officers filed back into their vehicles like ghosts, engines purring low, disappearing down the road as easily as they had arrived. They left behind no wreckage, just reflection. Inside McNally's, people spoke in lower voices now, as if trying not to disturb something fragile in the air. Some left early, nodding quietly at Tommy as they passed, eyes a little softer, backs a little straighter. Outside, Jack Carter remained on the bench. It was the same wooden bench he'd sat on before the storm came through. Before his son walked in with nothing but presence and conviction, and changed the atmosphere of a town. Now it was quiet, peaceful. Jack traced the grain of the bench with a single calloused finger. His face still bore the bruise from the biker's fist, but the swelling had begun to go down. A butterfly bandage lay gently across his cheek, applied by one of the Special Forces medics with such reverence it might as well have been a military decoration. The cloth still sat folded in his lap. To anyone else, it was just a rag, but to Jack, it was memory stitched into fabric, of Mary wiping down glasses behind the bar, of laughter clinking in glasses, and jukeboxes playing real music, not digitized noise. He closed his eyes for a moment, not to sleep, just to feel the sun on his face again. It had been a long time since he'd allowed himself to be still and feel safe. A small voice broke the quiet. "Are you the man from the video?" Jack opened one eye. A boy, maybe 6, maybe 7, stood beside him. Curly brown hair, red sneakers, and the kind of nervous bravery only children and soldiers knew how to carry. His mother stood a few paces back, phone in hand, worry in her expression. Jack straightened a little, then nodded. "I suppose." The boy stepped closer, eyeing the bandage. "Did it hurt?" Jack smiled gently. "Yes, but not as much as you'd think." "Why'd he hate you?" Jack paused. That was the question, wasn't it? "Because I was doing something kind," he said. "And sometimes people mistake kindness for weakness." The boy furrowed his brow. "That doesn't make sense." "No," Jack agreed. "It doesn't, but it happens." The boy climbed up onto the bench beside him, legs swinging off the edge. You didn't fight back. Jack turned to look at him. No, he said, I didn't. Why not? Jack thought for a moment. The honest answer would have taken hours, decades, wars. Because sometimes the strongest thing you can do, he finally said, is not fight. Sometimes the real fight is knowing who you are and not letting anyone take that away. The boy was quiet, absorbing it in the way only children could, without argument, just awe. Your son came, Jack nodded. He's a soldier, the boy said proudly. So was I. Are you still? Jack looked down at his hands. They were veined and scarred and older than he ever expected them to be. He looked back at the boy and smiled. Once a soldier, always a soldier. Just not the kind with guns anymore. What kind then? Jack turned back to the horizon. The kind who remembers. The kind who teaches. The boy leaned his head against Jack's arm for a moment. Uninvited, but welcome. His mother started forward, but Jack raised a hand and gave her a small nod. She stopped and smiled. After a moment, the boy looked up again. Will I be brave like you one day? Jack looked down at him, really looked. It wasn't about the uniform, or the medals, or the years spent chasing things too large to name. Bravery, Jack had learned, didn't come with age or rank. It came from a decision. Yes, Jack said softly, if you choose to be. The boy thought for a long moment. Then he slid off the bench, straightened his back like he'd seen Mason do earlier, and raised his hand in a salute, awkward but sincere. Jack returned it, crisp and perfect. The boy grinned and ran back to his mother, who mouthed, "Thank you," before guiding him away. Jack turned his eyes back to the road. Another generation had just passed by, not in ceremony, but in story, not with a rifle, but with a question. He leaned back against the bench. Behind him, Ellie appeared at the bar door, hesitated, and then approached. Mind if I sit? Jack shook his head. She sat beside him, her phone still in her hand. Your video's everywhere now, she said. Jack raised an eyebrow. Everywhere? Millions of views, thousands of comments. People are saying they feel ashamed, inspired, angry, mostly thankful. Jack nodded slowly. I didn't want a spectacle, he said. It's not a spectacle, Ellie replied. It's a reminder. They sat in silence for a while. The sun had nearly set. But the light hadn't vanished. Not yet. Maybe not all at once, he said. But if that boy grows up remembering today, then, so Part 9, A Town Remembered. The days that followed didn't bring fireworks, no newspaper headlines, no official ceremonies. But something in Stafford Falls had changed, quietly and deeply. It started with the door. McNally's, once just another watering hole on Main Street, now had a new entryway sign above the frame. Built by a soldier, guarded by honor. Tommy hung it himself at dawn, the day after the incident, before the first cup of coffee was poured, before the first stool was warmed. He didn't say much while he worked, but his hands moved with purpose, as if by fixing the wood, he could start to fix something else. Inside, the bar looked the same, but the way people moved within it didn't. Conversations lowered when Jack entered, not out of fear, but respect. Patrons stood up instinctively when he passed, like students rising when a teacher enters the room, not because anyone told them to, but because now they understood they should have all along. No one dared take the bench near the door anymore. It became Jack's bench, an unofficial memorial to living values, kindness, restraint, and resilience wrapped in a cane and a cloth. Ellie, now known as the girl who filmed the moment, received messages from as far as Oregon, Maine, and even overseas. Veterans from 3 wars reached out to say thank you. High schoolers messaged her to say they cried. Parents thanked her for capturing something real in a world where truth often gets buried beneath noise. But the real change came not in comments or views, but in conversations. At the diner across from the bar, tables once filled with sports talk began discussing character. At the high school, a social studies teacher played Ellie's video for her class. The students were silent after. Then one boy raised his hand and asked, "Why didn't anyone help?" There was no easy answer, so the teacher invited Jack Carter to speak the following week. When Jack arrived, dressed not in uniform, but in the same plain shirt he always wore, every student stood without being told. The principal hadn't asked them to. They just did. Jack didn't talk about medals. He talked about what it meant to keep your word. What it meant to walk into a room and choose to do the right thing, even if your voice shakes, even if your knees do too. He said one line that made it into the school newsletter, then the town paper, then onto a mural painted by a group of local teens on the alley wall beside the bar. "If you're the only one standing, stand anyway." It became the town's unofficial motto. On Saturdays, more veterans began to appear at McNally's. Men and women Jack hadn't seen in years. Some with walkers, some with prosthetics, some with scars that didn't show. They came not to drink, but to be seen. For so long, they'd felt like relics. Now they were reminders. One evening, as the jukebox played softly in the background, a Gulf War vet named Raymond placed his hand on Jack's shoulder and said, "You reminded them we're still here." Jack smiled. "You've always been here. They just needed to remember how to look." Word of the town's change reached beyond Stafford Falls. A neighboring county invited Jack to speak at a civic forum. A college journalism student asked to write a thesis on viral virtue, the moment that taught a town to care. A VFW chapter raised money to install a bench downtown, engraved with the words, "Silence is easy, honor takes effort." None of it was Jack's doing. He hadn't asked for a movement. He had simply refused to stay invisible. One night, as he sat alone on the bench again, Ellie joined him with a cup of coffee. She'd started bringing him one every Saturday now. Cream. No sugar, just how he liked it. "You know," she said, "I keep thinking about how quickly everything happened. One punch, one phone call, one post, and now all this." Jack nodded slowly. "That's how change works," he said. "It doesn't shout, it echoes." They sat together in silence for a moment. Ellie glanced toward the mural in the alley. The words, painted in bold white letters, "If you're the only one standing, stand anyway," glowed in the amber light of a nearby street lamp. "Do you think it'll last?" she asked. Jack sipped his coffee, thought carefully. "It'll last," he said, "if we choose to remember." And they would remember, because something in Stafford Falls had cracked open, not in anger, but in clarity. A small town, no longer sleepwalking, now carried the weight of a question on its shoulders. Who are we when it matters most? It was no longer a question they could ignore. Something will. Part 10, The Legacy Shift. It was a Tuesday, no special occasion, no speeches scheduled. No new sign to hang, just another warm, blue sky afternoon in Stafford Falls. Jack Carter sat on the porch of his modest home, the same one he and Mary had bought 5 decades earlier. back when linoleum was fashionable and front porches were where the world slowed down. His cane leaned against the railing. His cloth, freshly washed, hung to dry in the sunlight. In his hand was a folded letter, creased and yellowed from years of handling. The gate squeaked open. He didn't need to turn to know who it was. "You walk quieter than you used to," Jack said without looking up. Mason stepped onto the porch with a soft smile. "That's what happens when your father teaches you how to move like a ghost." They embraced. Not long, not dramatic. Just enough to say what needed saying. Mason took the chair beside him. For a while, they just sat. Wind rustled through the oak trees. A neighbor's lawnmower buzzed somewhere in the distance. From inside, an old record played softly, a Sinatra tune. Jack still kept in the rotation, even if the player sometimes skipped. "So," Mason finally said, "how's the town treating you?" Jack shrugged, though it carried the weight of something more. "They're trying. Some days it feels like progress. Other days, like penance." Mason nodded. "Either one's better than pretending nothing happened." Jack chuckled. "You sound more like me every day." Mason looked at his father, then down at the letter in Jack's hand. "You still carry it?" Jack unfolded it carefully. Mason recognized it immediately. The same one he had written when he enlisted. The ink had faded, but the words remained etched in both their memories. "When you stand alone, as you will someday, stand for the man I raised you to be, not the man others expect." Jack handed it over. Mason read the line again, slower this time. "You meant every word of this, didn't you?" "I meant them more than I've ever meant anything." There was no need for embellishment. Jack wasn't a man who dealt in flowery truths. "But I've learned something since then," Jack added. "What's that?" "That legacy isn't what you leave behind when you die. It's what you build while you're still here, what you give away while you're alive." Mason leaned back in his chair, thinking. "That's the thing about serving," he said. "We're trained to lead, to protect, but sometimes I wonder if we ever learned how to pass it on." Jack nodded. "That's the hardest part, teaching values without telling people what to think. Just living it, long enough, consistently enough, until someone notices." Mason smiled. "Seems like someone did." Jack tilted his head, curious. "Ellie, that boy on the bench, all those kids in the school who stood up when you walked in. You didn't give them a lecture. You gave them a story." Jack looked off toward the yard, where the shadows of trees danced across the grass. "I didn't set out to teach anyone anything," he said. "I just didn't want to let myself go quiet when it mattered." "That's the whole lesson, isn't it?" Mason said. "That honor isn't loud. It just refuses to be erased." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was shared. Two men, two generations, sitting in the same truth. That values weren't taught through orders. They were witnessed, chosen, lived. Mason reached into his jacket and pulled something out. A pin, small, worn. The edges dulled by time. Jack recognized it immediately. "Your first unit pin," he said. Mason nodded. "The one you gave me when I left for basic. I figured you'd lost it in a war zone somewhere." "Never," Mason said. "I kept it." And now he held it out. Jack hesitated. "Why are you giving it back?" "Because I think it's time it goes somewhere else." Jack looked at him, confused. "You've carried it long enough," Mason said. "You became what it stood for. Now, maybe someone else needs to carry the symbol, while you carry the legacy." Jack didn't take it right away. Not because he didn't want to, but because he knew the weight it carried. He looked at Mason and saw not a boy, not even a soldier, but a man shaped by the quiet choices between what's easy and what's right. He finally reached out and took the pin. "Thank you," he said. "For what?" Mason asked. "For proving that silence doesn't get the last word." They sat a while longer, watching the sun drift downward, casting gold across the town they had both helped shape, one with his hands, the other with his voice. Before Mason left, he turned back from the gate. "Dad." "Yeah?" "If that punch had landed just a little harder, if I hadn't come." Jack held up a hand. "Don't." Mason stopped. "You came, and not with fury, but with clarity. That's what mattered." Jack smiled. "You reminded them, and in doing so, reminded me that the legacy isn't mine alone to carry." "Mason, no. I'll be back next month." "Bring your boys," Jack said. "It's time they learned to wipe a table properly." They both laughed, and in the fading light of that quiet Tuesday, nothing grand happened. No medals were awarded, no flags were raised, but a legacy was handed down and accepted. Part 11. The Echo. The seasons shifted gently in Stafford Falls. Summer gave way to fall with only the lightest protest. Crisp mornings, golden leaves, and that familiar scent of wood smoke curling through the town. The rhythm of the place hadn't changed much, but the feel of it had. There was more eye contact now, more held doors, more nods exchanged between strangers that carried the weight of "I see you." At McNally's, Saturdays had become something sacred again. Not because of the drinks, because of the ritual. Each Saturday morning, before the bar opened, a new group of volunteers arrived early. Young, old, civilian, veteran. Some came with brooms, others with rags. "I'll be back next month." "Bring your boys," Jack said. "It's time they learned to wipe a table properly." They both laughed, and in the fading light of that quiet Tuesday, nothing grand happened. No medals were awarded, no flags were raised, but a legacy was handed down and accepted. The season shifted gently in Stafford Falls. Summer gave way to fall with only the lightest protest. Crisp mornings, golden leaves, and that familiar scent of wood smoke curling through the town. The rhythm of the place hadn't changed much, but the feel of it had. There was more eye contact now, more held doors, more nods exchanged between strangers that carried the weight of "I see you." At McNally's, Saturdays had become something sacred again, not because of the drinks, because of the ritual. Each Saturday morning, before the bar opened, a new group of volunteers arrived early. Young, old, civilian, veteran. Some came with brooms, others with rags. All came to honor a man who once walked in aloe, quietly wiping tables, long before anyone realized they were witnessing devotion in its purest form. Jack still came, of course, but he didn't wipe tables alone anymore. Sometimes he stood back and watched as others carried out what used to be his private rhythm. He didn't correct them, he didn't lead them. He simply smiled and nodded when they folded the cloth the right way. He still kept Mary's cloth, though. Never used it anymore. Just folded it gently, placed in his shirt pocket like a medal of his own. One Saturday, Mason returned, not in uniform, not with a convoy, just as a son bringing his two boys for their first mission. They were both under 10, hair tousled, faces full of questions. Jack greeted them at the bench. "You ready to learn how to serve?" They looked up at him with reverence, not because they understood the depth of his service, but because they understood that when he spoke, people listened. He knelt beside them and handed each a rag. Serving doesn't always look like what you think. Sometimes it's loud. Sometimes it's muddy. Sometimes it's this. They wipe tables with small hands and great seriousness. And though some customers smiled, none interrupted, because they knew they were watching something more important than cleaning. They were watching a lesson. Ellie filmed again that day, not for the internet, not for another viral moment, but for the boys themselves. She sent the footage to Mason the next morning with a note. One day, they'll want to remember this. One day, they'll understand what they carried. Jack hadn't seen the video. He didn't need to. He lived it. But something else happened that Saturday. Something quieter than the military salute, more subtle than the echo of Mason's speech. It happened just after noon. The bar was beginning to fill. Conversation drifted comfortably. And then, the front door opened, and in walked a man no one had expected to see again. Jake Monroe. Not in leather, not in boots. He wore jeans, a tucked-in shirt, and a look that belonged to someone who'd walked through their own private reckoning. He didn't scan the room for control. He walked straight toward Jack. No one moved. Conversations halted, not in fear, but in curiosity. This time, no one looked away. Jake stopped in front of Jack's table, hands empty, shoulders low, voice quiet. "I don't expect forgiveness," he said, "but I came back to thank you." Jack tilted his head, measured. "For what?" "For standing still," Jake said. "You didn't swing back. You didn't curse. You didn't try to make me small. You just stayed upright. I've been thinking about that every day since." He paused. "I served too, years ago. Got out. Lost track of who I was. You reminded me." Jack looked at him, longer this time. "You didn't hit me," he said finally. "You hit what you thought didn't matter anymore." Jake nodded. "I know." Jack stood slowly, looked the man in the eye. "Sit." And Jake did. They didn't talk long, just enough. After he left, someone asked Jack why he'd invited him to sit. Jack answered without looking up. "Because people aren't fixed by shame. They're changed by example." That line made its way to a town council meeting the next week. Soon after, the local school district approved a new program, pairing veterans with at-risk youth for mentorship. Jack didn't volunteer to lead it, but he showed up to the first meeting with a clipboard and a thermos of coffee. The ripple widened. At the church, a new bulletin board was installed, Lessons from the Living. It featured handwritten quotes from local veterans. Jack's was the first one pinned. "You don't have to wear a uniform to serve. You just have to show up when it counts." The echo was real. Not because it was loud, because it was repeated, one action at a time, by people who'd once stayed silent. Now stepping forward. And still, every Saturday, Jack sat on the same bench. And Jake did. They didn't talk long, just enough. After he left, someone asked Jack why he'd invited him to sit. Jack answered without looking up. "Because people aren't fixed by shame. They're changed by example." That line made its way to a town council meeting the next week. Soon after, the local school district approved a new program, pairing veterans with at-risk youth for mentorship. Jack didn't volunteer to lead it, but he showed up to the first meeting with a clipboard and a thermos of coffee. The ripple widened. At the church, a new bulletin board was installed, Lessons from the Living. It featured handwritten quotes from local veterans. Jack's was the first one pinned. "You don't have to wear a uniform to serve. You just have to show up when it counts." The echo was real. Not because it was loud, Because it was repeated, one action at a time, by people who'd once stayed silent, now stepping forward. And still, every Saturday, Jack sat on the same bench. "Mr. Carter." Jack looked up. A teenager stood in front of him, maybe 17, dressed in a school jacket, holding a notebook and a recorder. His hands trembled just slightly, like he wasn't sure if he belonged here. Jack gave him a quiet nod. "Have a seat." The boy did, perched on the edge, like someone unsure if he'd earned the right. "My name's Henry," he said. "I'm doing a project for our senior ethics class. We were told to choose someone who changed something without using power. Everyone at school said I should talk to you." Jack raised an eyebrow. "Is that so?" Henry nodded. They said you taught this town how to remember itself." Jack chuckled. "I don't think I did anything that grand." Henry flipped open his notebook. "I watched the video, the one from years ago, the one where you got punched and didn't fight back. My dad says that was the day everything here changed." Jack leaned back slightly. "I didn't change the town," he said. "The town chose to change. I just gave it a reason." Henry was quiet for a moment, then asked, "Weren't you angry?" Jack looked toward the horizon. The light was soft, the kind that made memories feel closer than they were. "I was disappointed," he said. "Not in the man who hit me, in the ones who didn't stop him." Henry looked down. "My dad said he was here that night, said he didn't move. He regrets that every day." Jack nodded slowly. "He's not alone." Silence stretched between them again. But it wasn't awkward, it was respectful. Henry looked at him carefully, then asked, "How did you know what to do in that moment?" Jack thought for a long time before answering. "Because I've been hit before. In combat, in training, in life. What matters isn't the hit, it's who you become after. In that moment, I didn't need to swing. I needed to show everyone that silence doesn't get to win." Henry wrote that down quickly. Jack watched the boy's pen move. "You want to make a difference?" Henry looked up. "More than anything." "Then don't wait for someone to throw a punch," Jack said. "Look around you. See who's already bleeding. Stand beside them, even if no one else does." Henry's eyes widened. He nodded. Jack continued, softer now. "We keep thinking legacy is about doing something big, but it's not. It's about doing the right thing when no one's clapping, when no one's looking. That's where it starts." Henry was quiet again, scribbling notes. Jack smiled faintly. "You'll do fine," he said. "Just remember, your strength isn't in how loud you get, it's in how long you stand." Henry closed his notebook. "Thank you, sir." He stood, turned, and then hesitated. He looked back. "Can I ask you one more thing?" "Sure. Are you proud of what happened that day? Of how it all turned out?" Jack's face softened. He reached into his breast pocket and pulled out the cloth. Mary's cloth. Still clean, still folded perfectly. "I'm proud," he said, "that something small meant enough to be remembered." Henry nodded, and in an instinct born of reverence, not instruction, he raised his hand in a salute. Jack returned it with precision. The boy walked away. Jack leaned back into the bench, the sun warming his jacket, the cloth warm in his hand. He had no idea what the boy would write, whether his words would end up in a school paper, an internet archive, or a dusty binder in a classroom. But he knew the echo would continue, because values, once passed forward, don't stop. They ripple. Through bar stools and classrooms, through teenagers and town halls, through quiet men on wooden benches who refuse to bend. They ripple through every single person who watched something wrong and chose not to look away next time. Jack closed his eyes. He didn't need headlines or another medal. The town remembered, and that was enough.
This audio is made with Audio Toolkit for Windows Store, downloaded for free now.